Hey everybody, how you guys doing on this Saturday? Let me see how many people appeared, hopefully. Wonder how many other, whoops, that's not what I wanted to see. Blooper, okay. Let's see, participants. Yay, we have an English Inquisitor. We have Pandas Burritos. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today we're reading chapters 5 and 6 of Patricia Cornwell's Postmortem. For those of you that aren't seeing the live chat and the thing, it's my computer. Don't worry about it. It does that. Let's see if I can do that and get everybody back in here. Um, Over the past few chapters, we have not only discovered the deceased, we have a police officer that is, in a cliche sense, looking at the husband as being the murderer of the wife. Even though there is a serial killer around that is killing people with the same signature in which they found the newest body. We have introduced Scarpetta, the main character of the story. Marino is the detective or the police officer that is in charge of doing all the investigations. That tends to butt heads a bit with Scarpetta. And a few other characters, including Lucy. I thank you for returning, English Inquisitor. So, yes, Thrax is an honorary wrench holder because Thrax is my internet son and the guard dragon of the internet. So that is why he has a wrench. He has an honorary wrench which does not get taken away. I tend to rotate wrenches in and out, and the Nightbot will be shilling different things, and also it has commands to where you can actually have fun with it while I'm reading the story. So I hope you enjoy that. So here is Chapter 5 of Patricia Cornwell's novel Postmortem. The 6th Street Marketplace is a bayside without the water, one of these open, sunny malls built of steel and glass on the north edge of the banking district in the heart of downtown. It wasn't often I went out for lunch, and I certainly didn't have time for the luxury this afternoon. I had an appointment in less than an hour, and there were 2 sudden deaths and 1 suicide in transport, but I needed to unwind. Marino bothered me. His attitude toward me reminded me of medical school. I was one of 4 women in my class at Hopkins. I was too naive in the beginning to realize what was happening. The sudden creaking of chairs and loud shuffling of papers when a professor would call on me were not coincidence. It was not a chance when old tests made the rounds but were never available to me. The excuses, you wouldn't be able to read my writing or someone else is borrowing them right now, were too universal when I went from student to student on the few occasions I missed a lecture and needed to copy someone else's notes. I was a small insect faced with formidable mail network web in which I might be ensnared, but never a part. Isolation is the cruelest of punishments, and it never occurred to me that I was something less than human because I wasn't a man. One of my female classmates eventually quit. Another suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Survival was my only hope. Success, my only revenge. Let me explain this. This book was written in 1990. The medical examining field was a male-dominated field, and women were slowly trickling in, but they were facing challenges in the educational process in order to become a medical examiner. So yes, they were being treated as second-class citizens at this time. So it's not that social justice is seeping into the book. It's that was the climate when you were trying to become a medical examiner at the time or trying to break into any predominantly male field. So I will now continue the book. I thought those days were behind me, but Marino brought all of it back. I was more vulnerable now because these murders were affecting me in a way others had not. I did not want to be alone in this, but Marino seemed to have his mind made up. Not only about Matt Peterson, but also about me. The midday stroll was soothing, the sun bright and winking on windshields of the passing traffic. The double glass doors leading inside the marketplace were open to let the spring breeze in, and the food court was as crowded as I knew it would be. Waiting my turn at the carry-out salad counter, I watched people go by, young couples laughing and talking and lounging at small tables. I was aware of women who seemed alone, preoccupied professional women wearing expensive suits and sipping diet colas or nibbling on pita bread sandwiches. It could have been in a place like this he first spotted his victims. Some large public place where the only thing the four women had in common was that he took their orders at one of the counters. But the overwhelming and seemingly enigmatic problem was that the murdered women did not work or live in the same areas of the city. It was unlikely they shopped or dined out or did their banking or anything else in the same places. Richmond has a large land area with thriving malls and business areas in 4 major quadrants. People who live north side are catered to by the north side merchants. The people south of the river patronize the south side businesses, and the same is true in the eastern part of the city. I mainly restricted myself to the malls and restaurants in the West End, for example, except when I was at work. The woman at the counter who took my order for a Greek salad paused for a moment, her eyes lingering on my face as if I looked familiar to her. I uncomfortably wondered if she'd seen my picture in the Saturday evening paper. Or she could have seen me in the television footage and court sketches the local television stations were constantly pulling out of their files whenever murder was big news in Central Virginia. It has always been my wish to be unnoticed, to blend. But I was at a disadvantage for several reasons. There were few women chief medical examiners in the country, and this prompted reporters to be unduly tenacious when it came to pointing cameras in my direction or excavating for quotes. I was easily recognized because I am distinctive in appearance, blonde and handsome, and Lord knows what else I've been called in print. My ancestors are from northern Italy, where there was a segment of blue-eyed, fair natives who share blood with the people of Savoy, Switzerland, and Austria. The Scarpettas are a traditionally ethnocentric group, Italians who have married other Italians in this country to keep the bloodline pure. My mother's greatest failure, so she has told me numerous times, is that she bore no son, and her 2 daughters have turned out to be genetic dead ends. Dorothy sullied the lineage with Lucy, who is half Latin, and at my age and marital status, it wasn't likely I would be sullying anything. Hello, Penina. How are you doing today? My mother is prone to weeping as she bemoans the fact that her immediate family is at the end of its line. All that good blood, she would sob, especially during the holidays when she would have been surrounded by a bevy of adorable and adoring grandchildren. Such a shame. All that good blood, our ancestors, architects and painters, to let that go to waste like fine grapes on the vine. We are traced back to Verona, the province of Romeo Montague and Juliet Capulet, of Dante, Pisano, Titian, Bellini, and Paolo Cagliari, according to my mother. She persists in believing we are somehow related to these luminaries, despite wry reminders that Bellini, Pisano, and Titian, at any rate, influenced the Veronese school, but were really native to Venice, and the poet Dante was Florentine, exiled after the Black Guelph triumph, and relegated to wandering from city to city. His stay in Verona, but a pit stop along the way to Ravenna. Our direct ancestors, in truth, were with railways or were farmers, humble people who migrated to this country 2 generations ago. A white bag in hand, I eagerly embraced the warm afternoon again. Sidewalks were crowded, hey, gerbil, with people wandering to and from lunch. As I waited on a corner for the light to change, I instinctively turned toward the 2 figures emerging from the Chinese restaurant across the street. The familiar blonde hair had caught my eye. Bill Bolts, the Commonwealth's attorney for Richmond City, was slipping on a pair of sunglasses. And seemed in the midst of an intense discussion with Norman Tanner, the Director of Public Safety. For a moment, Bolts was staring straight at me, but he didn't return my wave. Maybe he really didn't see me. I didn't wave again. Then the 2 men were gone, swept up in the congested flow of anonymous faces and scuffling feet. Hello, Diz. When the light turned green after an interminably long time, I crossed the street, and Lucy came to mind as I approached a computer software store. Ducking in, I found something she was sure to like. Not a video game, but a history tutorial complete with art, music, and quizzes. Yesterday, we had rented a paddle boat in the park and drifted around the small lake. She ran us into the fountain to give me a tepid shower, and I found myself childishly paying her back. We fed bread to the geese and sucked on grape snow cones until our tongues turned blue. Thursday morning, she would fly home to Miami, and I would not see her again until Christmas, if I saw her again at all this year. Hey, Mitch. It was 1:15 when I walked into the lobby of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, or OCME as it was called. Benton Wesley was 15 minutes early and sitting on the couch reading the Wall Street Journal. "Hope you got something to drink in that bag," he said drolly, folding the newspaper and reaching for his briefcase. "Wine vinegar. You'll love it." Hell, Ripple, I don't care. Some days I'm so desperate I fantasize that water cooler outside my door is full of gin. Sounds like a waste of imagination to me. No, just the only fantasy I'm going to talk about in front of a lady. Wesley was a suspect profiler for the FBI and located in Richmond's field office, where he actually spent very little time. When he wasn't on the road, he was usually with the National Academy in Quantico teaching death investigation classes and doing what he could to coax VICAP through its rocky adolescence. VICAP is an acronym for Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. One of VICAP's most innovative concepts was regional teams, which yoke a bureau profiler with an experienced homicide detective. Richmond PD called in VICAP after the second strangling. Marino, in addition to being a detective sergeant for the city, was Wesley's regional team partner. "I'm early," Wesley apologized, following me into the hallway. "Came straight here from a dental appointment. Won't bother me if you eat while we talk." "Well, it will bother me," I said. His blank look was followed by a sheepish grin as it suddenly occurred to him. "I forgot. You're not Doc Cagney. You know, he used to keep cheese crackers on the desk in the morgue, and in the middle of a post, he'd take a break for a snack. It was unbelievable." We turned off into a room so small it was really an alcove, where there was a refrigerator, Coke machine, and a coffee maker. He's lucky he didn't get hepatitis or AIDS," I said. "AIDS?" Wesley laughed. "That would have been poetic justice." Like a lot of good old boys I've known, Dr. Cagney was reputed to be acutely homophobic. "Just a goddamn queer," he was known to say when persons of a certain persuasion were sent in for examination. AIDS. Wesley was still enjoying the thought as I tucked my salad inside the refrigerator. Wouldn't I love to hear him explain his way out of that one? Hi, Fenrir. I'd gradually warmed up to Wesley. The first time I met him, I had my reservations. At a glance, he made one a believer in stereotypes. He was FBI right down to his Florsheim shoes. A sharp-featured man with predominantly silver hair, suggesting a mellow disposition that wasn't there. He was lean and hard and looked like a trial lawyer in his precisely tailored khaki suit and blue silk paisley printed tie. I couldn't recall ever seeing him in a shirt that wasn't white and lightly starched. We are reading Patricia Cornwell's Postmortem, chapters 5 and 6. The previous chapters are previous live streaming, Ben. Yep. He had a master's degree in psychology and had been a high school principal in Dallas before enlisting in the Bureau, where he worked first as a field agent, then undercover in fingering members of the mafia before ending up where he'd started, in a sense. Profilers are academicians, thinkers, analysts. That's okay, Finn. Sometimes I think they are magicians. Carrying our coffees, we turned left and stepped inside the conference room. Marino was sitting at the long table and going through a fat case file. I was mildly surprised. For some reason, I just assumed he'd be late. Before I had a chance to so much as pull out a chair, he launched in with a laconic announcement. "I stopped by serology a minute ago. Thought you might be interested in knowing Matt Peterson's a positive and a non-secreta." Wesley looked keenly at him. "Is this the husband you were telling me about?" "Yo, a non-secreta. Same as the guy snuffing these women." 20% of the population is non-secretor, I matter-of-factly said. Tiz. Before I had a chance to so much pull out a chair, he launched in with a laconic, whoops, hang on, there we go. Yeah, Marino said, 2 out of 10. Or approximately 44,000 people in a city the size of Richmond, 22,000 if half that number is male, I added. Lighting a cigarette, Marino squinted up at me over the big flame. You know what, Doc? The cigarette wagged with each syllable. You're beginning to sound like a damn defense attorney. A half hour later, I was at the end of the table, the 2 men on either side. Spread out before us were photographs of the 4 murdered women. This was the most difficult and time-consuming part of the investigation. Profiling the killer, profiling the victims, and then profiling the killer again. Wesley was describing him. This is what he did best, and quite often was uncannily accurate when he read the emotion of a crime scene, which in these cases was cold, calculating rage. I'm betting he's white, he was saying, but I won't stake my reputation on it. Cecil Tyler was black, and an interracial mix in victim selection is unusual unless the killer is rapidly decompensating. He picked up a photograph of Cecil Tyler, dark-skinned, lovely in life, and a receptionist at Northside Investment Firm. Like Laurie Peterson, she was bound, strangled, her nude body on top of the bed. Cecile. Dang it, I'm mispronouncing that. Not a good reader if I'm mispronouncing women's names. But we're getting more of them these days. That's the trend, an increase of sexual slaying in which the assailant is black, the women white, but barely the opposite. White men raping and murdering black women, in other words. Hookers are an exception. He glanced blandly at the array of photographs. These women certainly weren't hookers. I suppose if they had been, he muttered, our job would be a little easier. Yeah, but theirs wouldn't have been, Marino butted in. Wesley didn't smile. At least there would be a connection that maybe makes sense, Pete. The selection, he shook his head. This is peculiar. So what does photosis have to say these days? Marino asked, referring to the forensic psychiatrist who had been reviewing these cases. Not a whole hell of a lot, Wesley replied. Talking to him briefly this morning, he's being non-committal. I think the murder of this doctor is causing him to rethink a few things, but he's still damn sure the killer's white. The face from my dream violated my mind, the white face without features. He's probably between 25 and 35, Wesley continued, staring into his crystal ball, because the murders aren't related to any particular locality. He's got some way of getting around, a car versus a motorcycle or a truck or a van. My guess he's stashing his wheels in some inconspicuous spot, going the rest of the way on foot. His car's an older model, probably American, darker plain in color, such as beige or gray. Hello, Lord of Cancer. It wouldn't be the least bit uncommon for him to drive, in other words, the very sort of car plainclothes law enforcement officers drive. He wasn't being funny. This type of killer is frequently fascinated by police work and may even emulate cops. The classic post-offense behavior for a psychopath is to become involved in the investigation. Hello, Batman. He wants to help police, to offer insights and suggestions and assist rescue teams in their search for a body he dumped in the woods somewhere. He's the kind of guy who would think twice about hanging out at the Fraternal Order Police Lounge, clacking beer mugs with the off-duty cops. It has been conjectured that at least 1% of the population is psychopathic. Genetically, these individuals are fearless. They are people users and supreme manipulators. On the right side, they are terrific spies, war heroes, 5-star generals, corporate billionaires, and James Bonds. On the wrong side, they're strikingly evil. The Neros, the Hitlers, the Richard Specks, the Ted Bundys. Antisocial but clinically sane people who commit atrocities for which they feel no remorse and assume no blame. He's a loner, Wesley went on, and has a difficult time with close relationships, though he may be considered pleasant or even charming to acquaintances. He wouldn't be close to any one person. He's the type to pick up a woman in a bar, have sex with her, and find it frustrating and highly unsatisfactory. Don't I know the feeling, Marino said, yawning. Wesley elaborated. He would gain far more satisfaction from violent pornography, detective magazines, S&M, and probably entertained violent sexual fantasies long before he began to make the fantasies reality. The reality may have become with his peeping into the windows of houses or apartments where women live alone. It gets more real. Next, he rapes. The rapes get more violent, culminating in murder. This escalation will continue as he continues to become more violent and abusive with each victim. Rape is no longer the motive. Murder is. Murder is no longer enough. It also has to be more sadistic. His arm extended, exposing a perfect margin of stiff, white cuff. He reached for Laurie Peterson's photographs. Slowly, he looked through them one at a time, his face impassive. Lightly pushing the stack away from him, he turned to me. It seems clear to me that in her case, in Dr. Peterson's case, the killer introduced elements of torture. An accurate assessment? Accurate, I replied. What? Busting her fingers? Marino posed the question as if looking for an argument. The mob does shit like that. Sex murderers usually don't. She played the violin, right? Busting her fingers seems kind of personal, like the guy who did it knew her. As calmly as possible, I said. The surgical reference books on her desk, the violin. The killer didn't have to be a genius to pick up a few clues about her. Wesley continued. Another possibility is her broken fingers and fractured ribs are defense injuries. They aren't. I was sure of this. I didn't find anything to send me the message she struggled with him. Marino turned his flat, unfriendly eyes my way. Really? I'm curious. What do you mean by defense injuries? According to your report, she had plenty of bruises. Good examples of defense injuries, I met his gaze and held it, are broken fingernails, scratches, or injuries found in the areas of the hands and arms that would have been exposed had the victim attempted to ward off blows. Her injuries are inconsistent with this. Wesley summarized. Then we're all in agreement. He was more violent this time. Brutal's the word, Marino quickly said, as if this were his favorite point to make. That's what I'm talking about. Laurie Peterson's different from the other three. I suppressed my fury. The first three victims were tied up, raped, and strangled. Wasn't that brutal? Didn't they need to have their bones broken too? Wesley grimly predicted, if there's another one, it will be more pronounced signs of violence of torture. He kills because it's a compulsion, an attempt to feel some need. The more he does it, the stronger this need becomes and the more frustrated he gets. Therefore, the stronger the urge will become. He's becoming increasingly desensitized and is taking more with each killing to satiate him. The satiation is temporary. Over the subsequent days or weeks, the tension builds until he finds his next target. Stalks her and does it again. The intervals between each killing may get shorter. He may escalate, finally, into a spree murderer, as Bundy did. I was thinking of the time frame. The first woman had been murdered on April 19th. The second was on May 10th. The third, May 31st. Laurie Peterson was murdered a week later, on the 7th of June. The rest of what Wesley said was fairly predictable. The killer was from a dysfunctional home and might have been abused either physically or emotionally by his mother. When he was with a victim, he was acting out his rage, which was inextricably connected to his lust. The Batman. I know this is not the case, but it's the best twist. It would be the main character being the killer. Yeah, that would be the best twist. He was above average in intelligence and obsessive-compulsive and very organized and meticulous. He might be prone to obsessive behavior patterns, phobias or rituals such as neatness, cleanliness, his diet, anything that maintained his sense of controlling his environment. He had a job, which was probably menial. A mechanic, a repairman, a construction worker, or some other labor-related occupation. I noticed Marino's face getting redder by the moment. He was looking restlessly around the conference room. Is this secretly the killer? For him, Wesley was saying, the best part of what he does is the antecedent phase, the fantasy plan, the environmental cue that activates his fantasy. Where was the victim when he became aware of her? We did not know. She may not have known were she alive to tell. The interface may have been as tenuous and obscure as a shadow crossing her path. He caught a glimpse of her somewhere. It may have been at a shopping mall, or perhaps while she was inside her car and stopped at a red light. What triggered him? Wesley went on. Why this particular woman? Again, we did not know. We knew only one thing. Each of the women was vulnerable because she lived alone, or was thought to live alone, as in Lori Peterson's case. Sounds like your all-American Joe. Marino's acid remark stopped us cold. Flicking an ash, he leaned aggressively forward. Hey, this is all very good and nice, but me, I don't intend to be no Dorothy going down the yellow brick road. They don't all lead to the Emerald City, okay? We say he's a plumber of something, right? Well, Ted Bundy was a law student, and a couple of years back there's a serial rapist in D.C. who turns out to be a dentist. Hell, the Green Valley Strangler out there in the land of fruits and nuts could be a Boy Scout for all anybody knows. Marino was getting around to what was on his mind. I'd been waiting for him to start it. I mean, who's to say he ain't a student? Maybe even an actor, creative type, whose imagination's gone apeshit. One lust murder don't look much different from another, no matter who's committed it, unless the squirrel's into drinking blood or barbecuing people on spits, and this squirrel we're dealing with ain't Lucas. The reason these brands of sex murders are profiled pretty much the same, you want my opinion, is because with a few exceptions, people are people. Doctor, lawyer, or Indian chief, people think and do pretty much the same damn things going back to the days when cavemen dragged women off by their hair. Wesley was staring off. He slowly looked over at Marino and quietly asked, What's your point, Pete? Gerbil, I'm an investigator, been called in once, saw a guy with an A-head. So Gerbil, what's the prognosis answer? The bloke's dead. Start off on my genius, they all applaud. I love it, Gerbil. Wesley was saying, what's your point, Pete? I tell ya what the hell my point is. His chin was jutted out, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. This goddamn crap about who profiles right and who don't, it frosts me. What I got here is a guy writing his friggin' dissertation on sex and violence, cannibals, queers. He's got glitter crap on his hands that looks like the same stuff found on all the bodies. His prints are on his dead wife's skin and his knife stashed in one of his drawers. A knife that also has this glitter crap on the handle. He gets home every weekend right about the time the women get whacked. But no, hell no, he can't be the guy, right? And why? Because he ain't blue collar. He ain't trashy enough. Wesley was staring again. My eyes fell to the photograph spread out before us. Full-blown color shots of women who never in their worst nightmares would have believed anything like this could happen to them. Let me just lay this one on you. The tirade was about to end. Pretty boy Matt here. It so happens he ain't exactly pure as the driven snow. While I was upstairs checking with serology, I buzzed by Vander's office again to see if he'd turn up anything else. Peterson's prints are on file, right? You know why? He stared hard at me. I'll tell you why. Vander looked into it. Did this thing with his gizmos. Pretty boy Matt got arrested 6 years ago in New Orleans. This was the summer before he went off to college, long before he met his surgeon lady. Probably never even knew about it. Knew about what? Wesley asked. Knew her lover boy actor was charged with rape? That's what. No one said anything for a long time. Oh, I'm sorry, you weren't joking. I'm sorry, Gerbil. Wesley was slowly turning his Mont Blanc pen over and end over end on the tabletop, just his jaw firmly set. Marino wasn't playing by the rules. He wasn't sharing information. He was ambushing us with it as if this were court and Wesley and I were opposing counsel. I finally proposed. If Peterson was in fact charged with rape, then he was acquitted, or else the charges were dropped. Those eyes of his fixed on me like two gun barrels. You know that, do you? I ain't run a record check on him yet. A university like Harvard, Sergeant Marino, doesn't make it a practice to accept convicted felons. If they know. True, I agree. If they know. It's hard to believe they wouldn't know if the charge stuck. We'd better run it down, was all Wesley had to say about the matter. With that, Marino abruptly excused himself. I assumed he was going to the men's room. Wesley acted as if there was nothing out of the ordinary about Marino's outburst or anything else. He casually asked, "What's the word from New York, Kay? Anything back from the lab yet?" "DNA testing takes a while," I abstractedly replied. "We didn't send them anything until the second case. I should be getting those results soon. As for the second two, Cecile Tyler and Lori Peterson, we're talking next month at the earliest." He persisted in his nothing wrongs mode. "All 4 cases, the guy's a non-secretor. That much we know." "Yes, we know that much. There's really no doubt in my mind it's the same killer." "Nor in mine," I concurred. Nothing more was said for a while. We sat tensely, waiting for Marino's return, his angry words still ringing in our ears. I was perspiring and could feel my heart beating. I think Wesley must have been able to read the look on my face, that I wanted nothing more to do with Marino, that I had relegated him to the oblivion I reserve for people who are impossible and unpleasant and professionally dangerous. He said, "You have to understand him, Kay." "Well, I don't." "He's a good detective, a very fine one." I didn't comment. We sat silently. My anger began to rise. I knew better, but there was no stopping the words from boiling out. "Damn it, Benton. These women deserve our best effort. We screw it up and someone else may die. I don't want him screwing it up because he's got some problem." "He won't." "He already is." I lowered my voice. "He's got a noose around Matt Peterson's neck. It means he's not looking at anyone else." Marino, thank God, was taking a sweet time coming back. Wesley's jaw muscles were flexing and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "I haven't dismissed Peterson yet either. I can't. I know killing his wife doesn't fit with the other 3, but he's an unusual case. Take Gacy. We've got no idea how many people he murdered. 33 kids. Possibly it was hundreds. Strangers. All of them strangers to him. Then he does his mother and stuffs pieces of her down the garbage disposal." I couldn't believe it. He was giving me one of his young agents lectures, rattling on like sweaty palm teenage-year-old girl on his first date. Chapman's toting around a catcher in the rye when he wastes John Lennon. Reagan, Brady got shot by some jerk who obsessed with an actress. Patterns. We try to predict, but we can't always. It isn't always predictable. Next, he began reciting statistics. 12 years ago, the clearance rate for homicides averaged at 95, 96%. Now it was more like 74% and dropping. There were more stranger killings as opposed to crimes of passion and so on, and I was barely hearing a word of it. "Matt Peterson worries me, to tell you the truth, Kay." He paused. He had my attention. "He's an artist. Psychopaths are the Rembrandts of murderers. He's an actor. We don't know what roles he's played out of his fantasies. We don't know that he isn't making them reality now. We don't know that he isn't diabolically clever. His wife's murder might have been utilitarian." "Utilitarian?" I stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, staring in the photographs taken of Lori Peterson at the scene. Her face a suffused mask of agony, her legs bent, the electrical cord as taut as a bowstring in back and wrenching her arms up and cutting into her neck. I was seeing everything the monster did to her. Utilitarian? I wasn't hearing this. Wesley explained. Utilitarian in the sense he may have had a need to get rid of her, Kay. If, for example, something happened to make her suspect, he'd kill the first 3 women. He may have panicked, decided he had to kill her. How he can do that and get away with it? He can make her death look like the other ones. "I've heard shades of this before," I said evenly. "From your partner." His words were slow and steady like the beat of a metronome. "All possible scenarios, Kay. We have to consider them." "Of course we do, and that's fine as long as Marino considers all possible scenarios and doesn't wear blinders because he's getting obsessed or has a problem." Wesley glanced toward the open door. Almost inaudibly, he said, Pete's got his prejudices. I won't deny that. I think you'd better tell me exactly what they are. Let it suffice to say that when the Bureau decided he was a good candidate for a VICAP team, we did some checking into his background. I know where he grew up, how he grew up. Some things you never get over. They set you off. It happens. He wasn't telling me anything I hadn't already figured out. Marino grew up poor and on the wrong side of the tracks. He was uncomfortable around the sort of people who had always made him uncomfortable. The cheerleaders and homecoming queens never gave him a second glance because he was a social misfit, because his father had dirt under his nails, because he was common. I'd heard these cop sob stories 1,000 times before. The guy's only advantage in life is he's being white, and he's big and white, so he makes himself bigger and whiter by carrying a gun and a badge. We don't get to excuse ourselves, Benton, I said shortly. We don't excuse criminals because they had screwed up childhoods. We don't get to excuse the powers. We don't get to use the powers entrusted to us to punish people who remind us of our own screwed up childhoods. I wasn't lacking in compassion. I understood exactly where Marino was coming from. I was no stranger to his anger. I felt it many times when facing a defendant in court. No matter how convincing the evidence, if the guy's nice looking, clean cut and dressed in a $200 suit, 12 working men and women don't, in their hearts, believe he's guilty. I think she was saying that from a metaphorical sense. Like, the badge and gun made him feel more important, more powerful. This is a 1990s novel, so she was writing in metaphor, Finn. I could believe just about anything of anybody these days, but only if the evidence was there. Was Marino looking at the evidence? Was he even looking at all? Wesley pushed back his chair and stood up to stretch. Pete has his spells. You get used to it. I've known him for years. He stepped into the open doorway and looked up and down the hall. Where the hell is he, anyway? He fall in the John? Wesley concluded his depressing business with my office and disappeared into the sunny afternoon of the living where other felonious activities demanded his attention and his time. We'd given up on Marino. I had no idea where he'd gone, but his trip to the men's room apparently took him out of the building. Nor did I have a chance to wonder about it for very long, because Rose came through the doorway, linking my office with hers, just as I was locking the case files back inside my desk. I knew instantly by her weighty pause and the grim set of her mouth that she had something on her mind I didn't want to hear. Dr. Scarpetta, Margaret's been looking for you and asked me to tell you the minute you come out of your meeting. My impatience showed before I could check it. There were autopsies to look on downstairs and innumerable phone calls to return. I had enough to do to keep a half a dozen people busy and wanted nothing else to add to the list. Handing me a stack of letters to be signed, she looked like a formidable headmistress as she peered at me over her reading glasses and added, She's in her office, and I don't think the matter can wait. Rose wasn't going to tell me, and though I really couldn't fault her, I was annoyed. I think she knew everything that went on throughout the entire statewide system, but it was her style to direct me to the source instead of filling me in directly. In a word, she assiduously avoided being the bearer of bad news. I suppose she'd learned the hard way after working for my predecessor Cagney most of her life. Margaret's office was midway down the hall. A small Spartan room of cinder block walls painted the same insipid creme de menthe color as the rest of the building. The dark green tile floor always looked dusty, no matter how often it was swept, and spilling over her desktop and every other surface were reams of computer printouts. The bookcase was crammed with instruction manuals and printer cables, extra ribbons, and boxes of diskettes. There were no personal touches, no photographs, posters, or knickknacks. I don't know how Margaret lived with the sterile mess, but I'd never seen a computer analyst's office that wasn't. She had her back to the door and was staring at the monitor, a programmer manual opened in her lap. Swiveling around, she rolled the chair to one side when I came in. Her face was tense, her short black hair ruffled as if she had been raking her fingers through it, her dark eyes distracted. I was in a meeting most of the morning, she launched in. When I got here after lunch, I found this on the screen. She handed me a printout. On it were several SQL commands that allowed one to query the database. At first, my mind was blank as I stared at the printout. A describe had been executed on the case table, and upper half page was filled with column names. Below this were several simple select statements. The first one asked for the case number where the last name was Peterson, the first name Lori. Under it was the response, no records found. A second command asked for the case numbers and first names of every decedent whose record was in our database and whose last name was Peterson. Lori Peterson's name was not included in the list because her case file was inside my desk. I had not handed it over to the clerks up front for filing yet. Are you saying, Margaret, you didn't type in these commands? I most certainly didn't, she replied with a feeling. Nobody did it up front either. It wouldn't have been possible. She had my complete attention. When I left Friday afternoon, she went on to explain, I did the same thing I always do at the end of the day. I left the computer in answer mode so you could dial in from home if you wanted to. There was no way anyone used my computer because you can't use it when it's in answer mode unless you're at another PC and dialing my modem. That much made sense. The office terminals were networked to one Margaret worked on, which we referred to as the server. We were not linked to the Health and Human Services Department's mainframe across the street, despite the commissioner's ongoing pressure for us to do so. I had refused and would continue to do so because our data was highly sensitive, many of the cases under active criminal investigation. To have everything dumped in a central computer shared by dozens of other HHSD agents was an invitation to colossal security problem. I didn't dial in from home, I told her. I never assumed you did, she said. I couldn't imagine why you would type these commands. You, of all people, would know Lori Peterson's case isn't in yet. Someone else is responsible. Someone other than the clerks up front or the doctors. Except for your PC and the one in the morgue, everything else is a dumb terminal. A dumb terminal, she went on to remind me, is rather much what it sounds like, a brainless unit consisting of a monitor and a keyboard. The dumb terminals in our office were linked to the server in Margaret's office. When the server was down or frozen, it was true when it was in answer mode. The dumb terminals were down or frozen too. In other words, they've been out of commission since late Friday before Lori Peterson's murder. The data case violation had to have occurred over the weekend or at some point earlier today. Someone, an outsider, got in. This person had to be familiar with the relational database we used. A popular one, I reminded myself, and not impossible to learn. The dial-up number was Margaret's extension, which was listed in the HHSD's in-house directory. If you had a computer loaded with a communication software package, if you had a compatible modem, and if you knew Margaret was the computer analyst and tried her number, you could dial in. But that's as far as you would get. You couldn't access any of the office applications or data. You couldn't even get to the electronic mailboxes without knowing the usernames and passwords. Margaret was staring at the screen through her tinted glasses. Her brow was slightly furrowed, and she was nipping at a thumbnail. I pulled up a chair and sat down. How? The username and password. How did anyone have access to these? That's what I'm puzzling over. Only a few of us know them, Dr. Scarpetti. You, me, the other doctors, and the people who enter the data. And our usernames and passwords are different from the ones I assigned to the districts. Though each of my other districts were computerized with a network exactly like ours, they kept their own data and did not have online access to the central office data. It wasn't likely, in fact, I didn't think it was possible that one of my deputy chiefs from another office was responsible. I made a lame suggestion. Maybe someone guessed and got lucky? She shook her head. Next to impossible, I know. I've tried before, even when I changed someone's electronic mail password and can't remember what it is. After about 3 tries, the computer isn't forgiving. The phone line's disconnected. In addition, the version of the database doesn't like illegal logons if you type in enough of them. When you're trying to get into SQL or into a table, you get a context error. Whack the pointers out of alignment and crash the database. There's no other place the passwords might be, I asked. No other place in the computer, for example, where someone might be able to find out what they are if the person were another programmer? Wouldn't work, she was sure. I've been careful about it. There is a system table where the usernames and passwords are listed, but you could get into that only if you know what you're doing, and it doesn't matter anyway because I dropped that table a long time ago to prevent this very sort of problem. I didn't say anything. She was tentatively searching my face, looking for a sign of displeasure, a glint in my eyes telling her I was angry or blaming her. It's awful, she blurted out. Really, I don't have a clue. Don't know what all the person did. The DBA isn't working, for example. Isn't working? The DBA, or database administrator, was a grant-giving select person, such as Margaret or me, authority to access all tables and do anything we wished with them. For the DBA not to be working was the equivalent of being told the key to my front door no longer fit. What do you mean it isn't working? It was getting very difficult to sound calm. Exactly that. I couldn't get into any of the tables with it. The password was invalid for some reason. I had to reconnect the grant. How could that have happened? I don't know. She was getting more upset. Maybe I should change all of the grants for security reasons and assign new passwords? Not now, I automatically replied. We'll simply keep Laurie Peterson's case out of the computer. Whoever the person is, at least he didn't find what he was looking for. I got out of the chair. This time he didn't. I froze, staring down at her. 2 spots of color were forming on her cheeks. I don't know if it's happened before. I have no way of knowing because the echo was off. These commands here, she pointed to the printout, are the echo of the commands typed on the computer that dialed up this one. I always leave the echo off, so if you're dialing in from home, whatever you're doing isn't echoed on this screen. Friday I was in a hurry. Maybe I inadvertently left the echo on or set it on. I don't remember, but it was on, she ruefully added. I guess it was a good thing. We both turned around at the same time. Rose was standing in the doorway. That look of on her face, oh no, not again. She waited for me to come out into the hallway, then said, the ME in Colonial Heights is on the line, on line 1. A detective from Ashlands is on line 2, and the commissioner's secretary just called. What? I interrupted. Her last remark was the only one I really heard. Ambergy's secretary? She handed me several pink telephone slips as she replied, the commissioner wants to see you. About what, for God's sake? If she told me one more time, I'd have to hear the details for myself. I was going to lose my temper. I don't know, Rose replied. His secretary didn't say. Does anyone want to come in to discuss the last chapter, or do you want me to go ahead and read chapter 6 and then have the discussion? It's not that I'm being quiet, it's that I'm taking sips of coffee, waiting for the delay, because somehow this silence kind of bugs me. Hey, Tail. Apart from the gerbil like footprints. Okay, so I'll go ahead and continue another chapter. All right, here we go. I'll do chapter 6, and then I'll invite some people on to discuss. All right. Chapter 6. I couldn't bear to sit at my desk. I had to move about and distract myself before I lost my composure. Someone had broken into my office computer, and Ambergy wanted to see me in an hour and 45 minutes. It wasn't likely he was merely inviting me to tea. So I was making evidence rounds. Usually this entailed my receiving evidence to various labs upstairs. Other times I simply stopped by to see what was going on with my cases, the good doctor checking in on her patients. At the moment, my routine was veiled and desperate. How the hell do I pronounce that? I'm going to skip that word because I have got no clue how to pronounce that without looking it up. Sorry, guys. The Forensic Science Bureau was a beehive, a honeycomb of cubicles filled with laboratory equipment and people wearing white lab coats and plastic safety glasses. A few of the scientists nodded and smiled as I passed their open doorways. Most of them didn't look up, too preoccupied with whatever they were doing to pay passerby any mind. I was thinking about Abby Turnbull, about other reporters I didn't like. Did some ambiguous journalist pay a computer hack to break into our data? How long had the violations been going on? I didn't realize I'd turned into the serology lab until my eyes were suddenly focusing on black countertops cluttered with beakers, test tubes, and Bunsen burners. Jammed on glass enclosed shelves were bags of evidence and jars of chemicals. And in the center of the room was a long table covered with a spread and sheets removed from Lori Peterson's bed. Did you leave your windows open? Somebody walked into the computer administrator's office and decided to help themselves, I guess. You're just in time, Betty greeted me. If you want acid indigestion, that is. No thanks. Well, I'm getting it ready, she added. Why should you be immune? Close to retirement, Betty had steel gray hair, strong features, and hazel eyes that could be unreadable or shyly sensitive depending on whether you took the trouble to get to know her. I liked her the first time I met her. The chief serologist was meticulous. Her acumen was as sharp as a scalpel. In private, she was an ardent bird watcher and an accomplished pianist who had never been married or sorry about the fact. I think she reminded me of Sister Martha, my favorite nun at St. Gertrude's parochial school. The sleeves of her long lab coat were rolled up to her elbows, her hands gloved. Arranged over her work area were test tubes containing cotton-tip swabs and the physical evidence recovery kit, or PERK, comprising the cardboard folder of slides and the envelopes of hair samples from Lori Peterson's case. The file of slides, the envelopes, and the test tubes were identified by computer-generated labels initialed by me, the fruits of yet one more of Margaret's programs. I vaguely recall the gossip at a recent Academy meeting in the weeks following the mayor of Chicago's sudden death. There were some 90 attempts at breaking into the medical examiner's computer. The culprits were thought to be reporters after the autopsy and toxicology reports. Who broke into my computer? And why? He's coming along well, Betty was saying. I'm sorry, I smiled apologetically, she repeated. I talked with Dr. Glassman this morning. He's coming along well with the samples from the first two cases and should have results for us in a couple of days. You sent up the samples from the last two yet? They just went out. She was unscrewing the top of a small brown bottle. Beaufriend will be hand-delivering them. Beaufriend? I interrupted. Or Officer Friendly, as he's known by the troops. That's his name, Beaufriend. Scout's honor. Let's see. New York's about a 60-hour drive. He should get them to the lab sometime this evening. I think they drew straws. I looked blankly at her. Straws? What could Ambergy want? Maybe he was interested in how the DNA testing was going. It was on everyone's mind these days. The cops, Betty was saying. Going to New York and all. Some of them have never been. Once will be enough for most of them, I commented abstractedly. Wait until they try changing lanes or finding a parking place. But he could have just sent a memo through the electronic mail if he'd had a question about DNA tests or anything else. That's what Ambergy usually did. In fact, that's what he'd always done in the past. That's the least of it. Our man Beau was born and bred in Tennessee and never goes anywhere without his piece. He went to New York without his piece, I hope. My mouth was talking to her. The rest of me was elsewhere. She said again. His captain told him to. Told him about the gun laws up there in Yankeeville. Beau was smiling when he came up to get the samples. Smiling and patting what I presume was a shoulder holster under his jacket. He got one of these John Wayne revolvers with a 6-inch barrel. These guys and their guns. It's so Freudian, it's boring. The back of my brain was recalling news accounts of virtual children who had broken into computers of major corporations and banks. Beneath the telephone on my desk at home was a modem enabling me to dial up the computer here. It was off limits, strictly verboten. Lucy understood the seriousness of her ever attempting to access the OCME data. Everything else she was welcome to do, despite my inward resistance, the strong sense of territory that comes from living alone. Batman, that's funny. Be a sight to see. Her mouth in the office while the rest of her's out shopping. That's funny. I recall the evening paper Lucy found hidden under the sofa cushion. I recall the expression on her face as she questioned me about the murder of Lori Peterson, and then the list of my staff's office and home telephone numbers. including Margaret's extension, tacked to the cork bulletin board above my home desk. I realized Betty hadn't said anything for quite a long time. She was staring strangely at me. "Are you all right, Kay?" "I'm sorry," I said again, this time with a sigh. Silent for a moment, she spoke sympathetically. "No suspects yet. It's eating me, too. I suppose it's hard to think of anything else." Even though I'd hardly given the subject a thought in the last hour or so, and I should be giving it all my full attention, I silently chastised myself. "Well, I hate to tell you, but DNA is not worth tinker's damn unless they catch somebody." "The enlightened stage where genetic prints are stored in a central database like fingerprint records," I muttered. "Will never happen as long as the ACLU has a thing to say about it." Didn't anybody have anything positive to offer today? A headache was beginning to work its way up from the base of my skull. "It's weird." She was dripping naphthyl acid phosphate on some circles of white filter paper. "You would think somebody somewhere has seen this guy. He's not invisible. He doesn't just beam into women's houses. He's got to have seen them at some point in the past to have picked them and followed them home. Even if he's hanging out in parks or malls or the like, someone should have noticed him, seems to me. If anybody's seen anything, we don't know about it. It isn't that people aren't calling," I added. "Apparently, the Crime Watch hotlines are ringing off the hook this morning, morning, noon, and night. But so far, based on what I've been told, nothing is panning out. A lot of wild goose chases." "That's right, a lot of them." Betty continued to work. This stage of testing was relatively simple. She took the swabs from the test tubes I'd sent to her, moistened them with water, and smeared filter paper with them. Working in clusters, she first dipped the naphthyl acid phosphate and then added drops of the fast blue B salt, which caused the smear to pop up purple in a matter of seconds if seminal fluid was present. I looked at the array of paper circles. Almost all of them were coming up purple. "The bastard," I said. "Lousy shot at that." She began describing what I was seeing. "These are the swabs from the back of her thighs," she said, pointing. "They came up immediately. The reaction wasn't quite as quick with the anal and vaginal swabs, but I'm not surprised. Her own body fluids would interfere with the test. In addition, the oral swabs are positive." "The bastard," I repeated quietly. "But the ones you took off the esophagus are negative. Obviously, the most substantial residues of seminal fluid were left outside the body. Misfires again. The pattern's almost identical to what I found with Brenda, Patty, and Cecile. Brenda was the first strangling, Patty the second, Cecile the third. I was startled by the note of familiarity in Betty's voice as she referred to the slain women. They had, in an odd way, become part of our family. We'd never met them in life, and yet now we know them all well. As Betty screwed the medicine dropper back inside its small brown bottle, I went to the microscope on a nearby counter, stared through the eyepiece, and began moving the wet mount around on the stage. In the field of polarized light were several multicolored fibers, flat and ribbon-shaped, with twists at irregular intervals. The fibers were neither animal nor man-made. "These what I collected from the knife?" I almost didn't want to ask. "Yes, they're cotton. Don't be thrown off by the pinks and greens and whites you're seeing. Dyed fabrics often make up a combination of colors you can't detect with the naked eye." The gown cut from Lori Peterson was cotton, a pale yellow cotton. I adjusted the focus. "I don't suppose there's any chance it could be from a cotton rag paper, something like that?" Lori apparently was using the knife as a letter opener. "Not a chance, Kay. I already looked at the sample of fibers from her gown. They're consistent with the fibers you collected from the knife blade." That was expert witness talk. Consistent this and reasonable that. Lori's gown was cut from her body with her husband's knife. Wait until Marino gets this lab report, I thought. Damn. Betty was going on. "I can tell you right off, the fibers you're looking at aren't the same as those found on her body, and on the frame of the window the police think the killer came through. Those are dark, black and navy blue with some red, a polyester and cotton blend. The night I'd seen Matt Peterson, he was wearing a white Izod shirt that I suspected was cotton and most certainly would not have contained black, red, or navy blue fibers. He was also wearing jeans, and most denim jeans are cotton. It was highly likely he left the fibers Betty just mentioned, unless he changed his clothes before the police arrived. Yeah, well, Peterson ain't stupid, I could hear Marino say. Ever since Wayne Williams, half the world knows fibers can be used to nail your ass. I went out and followed the hallway to the end, turning left into the tool marks and firearms lab, with its countertops and tables cluttered with handguns, rifles, machetes, shotguns, and Uzis, all tagged as evidence and waiting their day in court. Handgun and shotgun cartridges are scattered over desktops, and in a back corner was a galvanized steel tank filled with water and used for test fires. Floating placidly on the water's surface was a rubber duck. Frank, a wiry, white-haired man, retired from the Army's CID, was hunched over the comparison microscope. He relit his pipe when I came in and didn't tell me anything I wanted to hear. There was nothing to be learned from the cut screen removed from Lori Peterson's window. The mesh was synthetic and therefore useless as far as tool marks or even the direction of the cut was concerned. We couldn't know if it had been cut from the inside or the outside of the house because plastic, unlike metal, doesn't bend. The distinction would have been an important one, something I very much would have liked to know. If the screen was cut from the inside of the house, then all bets were off. It would mean the killer didn't break in, but out of the Peterson house. It would mean quite likely Marino's suspicions of the husband were correct. All I can tell you, Frank said, puffing out swirls of aromatic smoke, is it's a clean cut, made with something sharp like a razor or a knife. Possibly the same instrument used to cut her gown? He absently slipped off his glasses and began cleaning them with a handkerchief. Something sharp was used to cut her gown, but I can't tell you if it was the same thing used to cut the screen. I can't even give you a classification, Kay. Could be a stiletto, could be a saber, or a pair of scissors. The severed electrical cords and survival knife told another story. Based on a microscopic comparison, Frank had good reason to believe the cords had been cut with Mike Peterson's knife. The tool marks on the blade were consistent with those left on the severed ends of the cords. Marino, I dismally thought again. This bit of circumstantial evidence wouldn't amount to much had the survival knife had been found out in the open and near the bed instead of hidden inside Matt Peterson's dresser drawer. I was still envisioning my own scenario. The killer saw the knife on top of Lori's desk and decided to use it. But why did he hide it afterward? Also, if the knife was used to cut Lori's gown, and if it was also used to cut the electrical cords, then this changed the sequence of events as I had imagined them. I'd assumed when the killer entered Lori's bedroom, he had his own cutting instrument in hand, the knife or sharp instrument he used to cut the window screen. If so, then why didn't he cut her gown and electrical cords with it? How is it he ended up with a survival knife? Is it me or is Scarpetta trying to prove Marino wrong as much as she's trying to solve the case? It does sound that way, but I think she's trying to come at it from more of a clinical angle, like don't suspect that guy right away and don't condemn him right away. I think that's the angle she's coming at it from, in my opinion. Did he instantly spot it on the desk when he entered her room? He couldn't have. The desk was nowhere near the bed, and when he first came in, the bedroom was dark. He couldn't have seen the knife. He couldn't have seen it until the lights were on, and by then Lori should have been subdued, the killer's knife at her throat. Should the survival knife on the desk have mattered to him? It didn't make any sense, unless something interrupted him. Unless something happened to disrupt and alter his ritual. Unless an unexpected event occurred that caused him to change course. Frank and I batted this around. This is assuming the killer is not her husband, Frank said. Yes, this is assuming the killer is a stranger to Lori. He has his pattern, his MO, but when he's with Lori, something catches him off guard. Something she does. Or says, I replied, then proposed. She may have said something that momentarily stalled him. Maybe. He was skeptical. She may have stalled him long enough for him to see the knife on the desk, long enough for him to get the idea, but it's more likely, in my opinion, he found the knife on the desk earlier in the evening because he was already outside her house when she got home. No, I don't really think so. Why not? Because she was home for a while before she was assaulted. I'd gone through it many times. Lori drove home from the hospital and locked her front door and relocked it from the inside. She went into the kitchen and placed her knapsack on the table. She then had a snack. Her gastric contents indicated she had eaten several cheese crackers very close to the time she was assaulted. The food had scarcely begun to digest. Her terror when she was attacked could have caused her digestion to completely shut down. It's one of the body's defense mechanisms. Digestion shuts down to keep blood flowing to the extremities instead of to the stomach, preparing the animal for fight or flight. Only it hadn't been possible for her to fight. It hadn't been possible for her to flee anywhere. After her snack, she went from the kitchen to the bedroom. Give me a moment, please. All right. It had only it had been possible for her hadn't been possible for her to fight. It hadn't been possible for her to flee anywhere. After her snack, she went from the kitchen to the bedroom. The police had found out it was her habit to take her oral contraceptive at night, right before bed. Friday's tablet was missing from the foil pack inside the master bathroom. She took her tablet, perhaps brushed her teeth and washed her face, and then changed into her gown and placed her clothing neatly on the chair. I believe she was in bed when he attacked her not long afterward. He may have been watching her house from the darkness of the trees or the shrubbery. He may have waited until the lights were out until he assumed she was asleep. Or he may have observed her in the past and known exactly what time she came home from work and went to bed. I remembered the bed covers. They were turned down as if she'd been under them, and there was no evidence of a struggle anywhere else in the house. There was something else coming to me. The smell Matt Peterson mentioned, the sweaty, sweet smell. If the killer had a peculiar and pronounced body odor, it was going to be wherever he was. It would have lingered inside her bedroom had he been hiding there when Lori got home. She was a physician. Odors are often indications of diseases and poisons. Physicians are trained to be very sensitive to smells. So sensitive, I can often tell by the odor of blood at a scene that a victim was drinking shortly before he was shot or stabbed. Blood or gastric contents reminiscent of musky macaroons, of almonds, may indicate the presence of cyanide. A patient's breath smelling of wet leaves may indicate tuberculosis. Lori Peterson was a physician, like me. Had she noticed a peculiar odor the moment she walked into her bedroom, she would not have undressed or anything else until she determined the source of it. Cagney did not have any worries. Cagney did not have my worries, and there were times I felt haunted by this. What the hell? Oh, okay. All right, that's not a very good transition in her early novel. Cagney did not have my worries, and there were times I felt haunted by the spirit of the predecessor I had never met. A reminder of a power and invulnerability I would never have. In an unchivalrous world, he was an unchivalrous knight who wore his position like a panache, and I think a part of me envied him. His death was sudden. He literally dropped dead as he was crossing the living room rug to switch on the Super Bowl. But in the pre-dawn silence of an overcast Monday morning, he became the subject of his own instruction. A towel draped over his face, the autopsy suite held off from everyone but the pathologist whose lot was to examine him. For 3 months, no one touched his office. It was exactly as he had left it, except, I suppose, that Rose had emptied the cigar butts out of the ashtray. The first thing I did when I moved to Richmond was to strip his inner sanctum to a shell and banish the last remnant of his former occupant, including the hard-boiled portrait of him dressed in his academic gown, which was beneath a museum light behind his formidable desk. That was relegated to the pathology department at BMC, as was the entire bookcase filled with macabre mementos forensic pathologists are expected to collect, even if most of us don't. His office, my office now, was well lighted and carpeted in royal blue, the walls arranged with prints of English landscapes and other civilized scenes. I had few mementos, and the only hint of morbidity was the clay facial reconstruction of a murdered boy. Excuse me. That one came out of nowhere. Didn't give me time to mute. I am so sorry. Facial clay reconstruction of a murdered boy whose identity remained a mystery. I had arranged a sweater around the base of his neck and perched him on top of a filing cabinet, where he watched the open doorway with plastic eyes and waited in sad silence to be called by name. Sickly sweet, diabetic. Could be, Thrax, could be. Where I work was low profile, comfortable, but businesslike. My impedimenta deliberately unrevealing and bland. Though I somewhat smugly assured myself it was better to be viewed as a professional than as a legend, I secretly had my doubts. I still felt Cagney's presence in this place. People were constantly reminding me of him through stories that had become more apocryphal in the longer they lived on. He rarely wore gloves while doing a post. He was known to arrive at scenes eating his lunch. He went hunting with the cops. He went to barbecues with the judges, and the previous commissioner was obsequiously accommodating because he was absolutely intimidated by Cagney. I paled by comparison, and I knew comparisons were constantly being made. The only hunts and barbecues I was invited to were courtrooms and conferences in which the targets were drawn on me and fires lit beneath my feet. If Dr. Alvin Ambergy's first year in the commissioner's office was any indication, his next 3 promised to be the pits. My turf was his to invade. He monitored what I did. Not a week went by that I didn't get an arrogant electronic memo from him requesting statistical information or demanding an answer as to why the homicide rate continued to rise while other crimes were slightly on the decline, as if somehow it was my fault people killed each other in Virginia. What he had never done to me before was to schedule an impromptu meeting. He had something to discuss. If he didn't send a memo, he sent one of his aides. There was no doubt in my mind his agenda was not to pat me on the back and tell me what a fine job I was doing. I was abstractedly looking over the piles on my desk and trying to find something to arm myself with. Files, a notepad, clipboard. For some reason, the thought of going in there empty-handed made me feel undressed. Emptying my lab coat pockets of the miscellaneous debris I had a habit of collecting during the day, I settled for tucking in a pack of cigarettes, or cancer sticks as Ambergy was well known to call them, and I went out into the late afternoon. He reigned across the street on the 24th floor of the Monroe building. No one was above him except an occasional pigeon roosting on the roof. Most of his minions were located below on floor after floor of HHSD agencies. I'd never seen his office. I'd never been invited. The elevator slid open to a large lobby where his receptionist was ensconced with a U-shaped desk arising from a field of wheat-colored carpet. She was a bosomy redhead, barely out of her teens. When she looked up from her computer and greeted me with a practiced, perky smile, I almost expected her to ask if I had reservations and needed a bellhop to manage my bags. I told her who I was, which didn't seem to fan the smallest spark of recognition. I have a 4 o'clock appointment with the commissioner, I added. She checked his electronic calendar and cheerily said, "Please make yourself comfortable, Miss Scarpetta. Mr. Amberby will be with you shortly." As I settled myself on beige leather couch, I searched the sparkling glass coffee and end tables bearing magazines and arrangements yeah, of silk flowers. There wasn't an ashtray, not a single one, and at 2 different locations were "thank you for not smoking" signs. The minutes crept by. The redhead receptionist was sipping Perrier through a straw and preoccupied with her typing. At what point she thought to offer me something to drink. I smiled a no thank you, and her fingers flew again. Keys rapidly clicked, and the computer complained with a loud beep. She sighed as if she'd just gotten grave news from her accountant. My cigarettes were a hard lump in my pocket, and I was tempted to find a ladies' room and light up. At 4:30, her telephone buzzed. Hanging up, that cheery, vacant smile again, she announced, "You may go in, Mrs. Scarpetta." Defrocked and decidedly out of sorts, Mrs. Scarpetta took her at her word. The commissioner's door opened with a soft click of its rotating brass knob, and instantly on their feet were three men, only one of whom I was expecting to see, with ambergris, with Norman Tanner and Bill Bolts. And when it came to Bolts' turn to offer his hand, I looked at him straight in the eye until he glanced away uncomfortably. I was hurt and a little angry. Why hadn't he told me he was going to be here? Why hadn't I heard a word from him since our paths crossed briefly at Laurie Peterson's home? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Hold on. I gotta mute for a second. All right. Ambergris granted me a nod that seemed more dismissal and added, "Appreciate your coming," with the enthusiasm of a bored traffic court judge. A little man whose last post had been in Sacramento, where he picked up enough West Coast ways to disguise his North Carolina origins. He was the son of a farmer and not proud of the fact. He had a penchant for string ties with silver slides, which he wore almost religiously with a pinstripe suit, and on his right finger was a hunk of silver set with turquoise. His eyes were hazy gray, like ice. The bones of his skull sharply pronounced through his thin skin. He was almost bald. An ivory-winged chair had been pulled out from the wall and seemed to be there for me. Leather crate and ambergris stationed himself behind his desk, which I had heard of but never seen. It was huge, ornately carved masterpiece of rosewood, very old and very Chinese. Probably thrax, probably bolo ties. Ooh, sorry, I had to clear my throat. Behind his head was an expensive window affording him a vista of the city, the James River, a glinting ribbon in the distance, and South Side patchwork. With a loud snap, he opened a black ostrich skin briefcase before him and produced a legal yellow pad with his tight, snarled scrawl. He had outlined what he was going to say. He never did anything without his cue cards. "I'm sure you're aware of the public distress over these recent stranglings," he said to me. "I'm very aware of it. Bill, Norm, and I had an emergency summit meeting, so to speak, yesterday afternoon. This was apropos of several things, not the least of which was what was in the Saturday evening and Sunday morning papers, Dr. Scarpetta. As you may know, because of this fourth tragic death, the murder of the young surgeon, the news has gone out over the wire." I didn't know, but I wasn't surprised. "No doubt you've been getting inquiries," Ambergris blandly went on. "We've got to nip this in the bud, or we're going to have sheer pandemonium on our hands. It's one of the things the three of us have been discussing." "If you can nip the murders in the bud," I said just as blandly, "you'll deserve a Nobel Prize." "Naturally, that's our top priority," said Bolt, who had unbuttoned his dark suit jacket and was leaning back in his chair. "We've got the cops working overtime on them, Kay, but we're still in agreement. There's one thing we must control for the time being. These leaks to the press. The news stories are scaring the hell out of the public and letting the killer know everything we're up to." I couldn't agree more. My defenses were going up like a drawbridge, and I instantly regretted what I said next. "You can rest assured I have issued no statements from my office, other than the obligatory information of cause and manner. I'd answered a charge not yet made, and my legal instincts were bridling my foolishness. If I were here to be accused of indiscretion, I should have forced Ambergris anyway, to introduce such an outrageous subject. Instead, I sent up the flare I was on the run, and it gave them justification to pursue." "Well, now," Ambergris commented, his pale, unfriendly eyes resting briefly upon me, "you've just laid something on the table I think we need to examine closely." "I haven't laid anything on the table," I emphatically replied. I'm just stating a fact for the record." With a light knock, the red-headed receptionist came in with coffee, and the room abruptly froze into a mute tableau. The heavy silence seemed completely lost on her as she went. Oh, hang on. As she went to considerable lengths to make sure we had everything we needed, her attention hovering about bolts like a mist. He may not have been the best Commonwealth attorney the city had ever known, but he was by far the best looking. One of those rare blonde men to whom passing years were generous. He was losing neither his hair nor his physique, and the fine lines at the corner of his eyes were the only indication he was creeping close to 40. When she was gone, Bolt said to no one in particular, "We all know the cops occasionally have a problem with kiss and tell. Norm and I have had a few words with the brass. No one seems to know exactly where the leaks are coming from." I restrained myself. What did they expect? Well, one of the majors is in tight with Abby Turnbull, or whoever this guy is going to confess. Yeah, sorry about that. I squawked. That's funny, Batman. Ambergy flipped a page in his legal pad. So far, a leaked cited as medical source has been quoted 17 times in the papers since the first murder Scarpetta. This makes me a little uneasy. Clearly, the most sensational details, such as the ligatures, the evidence of sexual assault, how the killer got in, where the bodies were found, and the fact DNA testing is in the works, have been attributed to this medical source. He glanced up at me. Am I to assume the details are accurate? Not entirely. There are a few minor discrepancies. Such as, I didn't want to tell him. I didn't want to talk about these cases at all with him. But he had the right to the furniture inside my office if he wanted it. I reported to him. He reported to no one but the governor. For example, I replied, in the first case, the news report, there was a tan cloth belt tied around Brenda Stepp's neck. The ligature was actually a pair of pantyhose. Ambergy was writing this down. What else? In Cecile Tyler's case, it was reported her face was bleeding, that the bedspread was covered with blood. An exaggeration at best. She had no lacerations, no injuries of this nature. There was a little bloody fluid coming out of her nose and mouth, a post-mortem artifact. These details, Ambergy said as he continued to write, were they mentioned in the CME-1 reports? I had to take a moment to compose myself. It was becoming clear what was going through his mind. The CME-1s were medical examiner's initial report of investigation. The responding ME simply wrote down what he saw at the scene and learned from the police. The details were not always completely accurate because the ME on call was surrounded by confusion and the autopsy hadn't been performed yet. In addition, the MEs were not forensic pathologists. They were physicians in private practice, virtual volunteers who got paid $50 a case to be jerked out of bed in the middle of the night or have their weekends wrecked by car crashes, suicides, and homicides. These men and women provided a public service. They were the troops. Their primary job was to determine whether the case merited an autopsy, to write everything down and take a lot of photographs. Even if one of my MEs had confused a pair of pantyhose with a tan belt, it wasn't relevant. My MEs didn't talk to the press. Ambergy persisted. The bit about the tan cloth belt, the bloody bedspread, I'm wondering if these were also mentioned in the CME-1s. In the manner the press made reference to the details, I firmly replied, no. Tanner drove it in mind. We all know what the press does. It takes a mustard seed and turns it into a mountain. Listen, I said, looking at the three men. If your point is that one of my medical examiners is leaking details about these cases, I can tell you with certainty you're way off base. It isn't happening. I know both of my MEs who responded to the first two scenes. They've been MEs in Richmond for years, and have always been unimpeachable. I myself responded to the third and fourth scenes. The information is not coming from my office. The details, all of them, could have been divulged by anyone who was there. Members of the rescue squads who responded, for example. Leather quietly creaked as Ambergy shifted in his chair. I've looked into that. 3 different squads responded. No one paramedic was present at all 4 scenes. I said levelly. Anonymous sources are often a blend of numerous sources. A medical source could have been a combination of what a squad member said, what a police officer said, and what a reporter overheard or saw while waiting around outside the residence where the body was found. True, Ambergy nodded, and I don't believe any of us really think the leaks are coming from the medical examiner's office. At least not intentionally. intentionally? I broke out. Are you implying the leaks may be coming from my office unintentionally? Just as I was about to retort self-righteously what a lot of nonsense this was, I was suddenly struck silent. A flush began creeping up my neck as it came back to me with swift simplicity. My office database. It had been violated by an outsider. Was this what Ambergy was alluding to? How could he possibly know about it? Ambergy went on as if he hadn't heard me. People talk. Employees talk. They tell their families, their friends, and they don't intend any harm in most cases. But you never know where the buck stops. Maybe on a reporter's desk. These things happen. We're objectively looking into the matter, turning over every stone. We have to. As you must realize, some of what's been leaked has been the potential of doing serious damage to the investigation. Damn it. My bronchitis is making me cough again. Hold on. These things happen. Okay. We have to. As you must realize, some of what's been leaked has... All right. Tanner laconically added, the city managers, the mayor, they aren't pleased with this type of exposure. The homicide rate already given Richmond a black eye. The seasonal national news accounts of a serial murder are the last thing the city needs. Going up are dependent on big conferences, visitors. People don't want to come to a city where they fear for their lives. No, they don't, I coldly agreed. Nor would people want to think the city's major concern over these murders is there an inconvenience, an embarrassment, a potential obstruction to the tourist trade. Kay, Bolts quietly reasoned. Nobody's implying anything outrageous like that. Of course not, Ambergy was quick to add, but we have to face certain hard realities, and the fact is there's a lot simmering beneath the surface if we don't handle the matter with extreme care. I'm afraid we're in for a major eruption. Eruption? Over what? I warily asked, and automatically looked to Bolts. His face was tight, his eyes hard with restrained emotion. Reluctantly, he said, the last murder's a powder keg. There are certain things about Laurie Peterson case no one's talking about. Things that, thank God, the reporters don't know yet. But it's just a matter of time. Someone's going to find out, and if we haven't handled the problem first, sensibly and behind the scenes, the situation's going to blow sky high. Tanner took over, his long, lantern-shaped face very grim. The city is at risk for, well, litigation. He glanced at Ambergy, who signaled him with a nod to proceed. A very unfortunate thing happened, you see. Apparently, Laurie Peterson called the police shortly after she got home from the hospital, early Saturday morning. We learned this from one of the dispatchers on duty at the time. At 11 minutes before 1 a.m., a 911 operator got a call. The Peterson residence came up on the computer screen, but the line was immediately disconnected. Bolts said to me, as you may recall from the scene, there was a telephone on the bedside table. The cord ripped out of the wall. Our conjecture is Dr. Peterson woke up when the killer was inside her house. She reached for the phone and got as far as dialing 911 before he stopped her. Her address came up on the computer screen. That was it. No one said anything. 911 calls of this nature are dispatched to the patrolmen. 9 times out of 10, they're cranks, kids playing with the phone, but we can't ever be sure of that. Can't be sure the person isn't suffering a heart attack, a seizure, in mortal danger. Therefore, the operator is supposed to give the call a high priority. Then the dispatcher broadcasts it to the units on the street without delay, prompting an officer to drive past the residence and at least check to make sure everything's all right. Done. A certain 911 operator, who even as we speak is suspended from duty, gave the call a priority 4. Tanner interjected. There was a lot of action on the street that night, a lot of radio traffic. The more calls there are, the easier it is to rank something lower in importance than you maybe otherwise would. Problem is, once something's been given a number, there's no going back. The dispatcher's looking at the numbers on his screen. He's not privy to the nature of the calls until he gets to them. He's not going to get to a 4 anytime soon when he's got a backlog of 1s and 2s and 3s to send out to the men on the street. No question the operator dropped the ball, Ambergy mildly said, but I think one can see how such a thing could have happened. I was sitting so rigidly I was barely breathing. Bolts resumed in the same dull tone. It was some 45 minutes later when a patrol car finally cruised past the Peterson residence. The officer said he shone his spotlight over the front of the house. The lights were out. Everything looked, quote, secure. He gets a call of domestic fight in progress. Speeds off. It wasn't long after this Mr. Peterson apparently came home and found his wife's body. The men continued to talk, to explain. References were made to Howard Beach, to a stabbing in Brooklyn, in which the police were negligent in responding and people died. Courts in D.C., New York, have ruled the government can't be held liable for failing to protect people from crime. Makes no difference what the police do or don't do. Doesn't matter. We win the suit. If there is one, we still lose because of the publicity. I was scarcely hearing a word of it. Horrible images were playing crazily in my mind. The 911 call, the fact it was aborted, made me see it. I knew what happened. Lori Peterson was exhausted after her ER shift, and her husband had told her he would be in later than usual that night. So she went to bed, perhaps planning to sleep just a while until he got home, as I used to do when I was a resident and waiting for Tony to come home from the law library at Georgetown. She woke up at a sound of someone inside the house, perhaps the quiet sound of this person's footsteps coming down the hallway toward the bedroom. Confused, she called out the name of her husband. No one answered. In that instant, dark silence that must have seemed an eternity, she realized there was someone inside the house, and it wasn't Matt. Panicking, she flicked on the bedside lamp so she could dial the phone. By the time she'd stabbed out 911, the killer had gotten to her, jerked the phone line from the wall before she had a chance to cry out for help. Maybe he grabbed the receiver out of her hand. Maybe he yelled at her, or she began to plead with him. He'd been interrupted, momentarily knocked off guard. He was enraged. He may have struck her. This may be when he fractured her ribs. As she cowered in stunned pain, he wildly looked around. The lamp was on. He could see everything in the bedroom. He could see the survival knife on her desk. Her murder was preventable, could have been stopped. Had the call been given priority 1, had it immediately been dispatched over the air, the officer would have responded within minutes. He would have noticed the bedroom light was on. The killer couldn't see to cut cords and tie up his victim in the dark. The officer might have gotten out of his car and heard something. If nothing else, he'd taken the time to shine his light over the back of her house, then remove the window screen, the picnic bench. The open window would have been noticed. The killer's ritual took time. The police might have been able to get inside before he killed her. My mouth was so dry, I had to take several sips of coffee before I could ask. How many people know this? Bolts replied. No one's talking about it, Kay. Not even Sergeant Marino knows, or at least it's doubtful he does. He wasn't on duty when the call was broadcast. He was contacted at home after a uniform had already arrived at the scene. The words out in the department, those cops aware of what happened are not to discuss the matter with anyone. I knew what that meant. Loose lips would send the guy back to traffic or stick him behind a desk in the uniform room. The only reason we're apprising you of this unfortunate situation, Ambergy carefully chose his words, is because you need the background in order to understand the steps we feel compelled to take. I sat tensely, looking hard at him. The point of all of this was about to be made. I had a conversation with Dr. Spiro Fortosis last night, the forensic psychiatrist, who has been good enough to share his insights with us. I've discussed the cases with the FBI. It's the opinion of the people who are experts in profiling this type of killer that publicity exacerbates the problem. This type of killer gets off on it. He gets excited, hyper, when he reads about what he's done. It pushes him into overdrive. We can't curtail the freedom of the press, I bluntly reminded him. We have no control over what reporters print. We do. Ambergy was gazing out the window. They can't print much if we don't give them much. Unfortunately, we've given them a lot. Pause, or at least someone has. I wasn't sure where Ambergy was going, but the road signs definitely pointed in my direction. He continued. The sensational details, the leaks, we've already discussed. we've already discussed have resulted in graphic grisly stories, banner headlines. It's the expert opinion of Dr. Fortosis this may be what prompted the killer to strike again so soon. This publicly excites him, puts him under incredible stress. The urge peaks again, and he has to find release in selecting another victim. As you know, there was only a week between the slayings of Cecile and Lori Peterson. Have you talked to Benton Wesley about this? I interrupted. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. I can't. I'm losing my voice. I'm coughing way too freaking much to get to the end of the chapter. Normally, I would ask if anybody wants to be on, but you can hear my voice cracking. Please, at 8 p.m. tonight, Penina Chan, if she is still in the chat, is got a Let's Play that is rather suspenseful and can give you a jump scare or two. Please check her out.
Oh, she's doing that tonight?
Yep, she's doing that tonight. And as always, keep your mind open and inspiration will follow. Have a good Saturday.